Hi guys, welcome back to the second part of chapter 37. So we're going to be covering the ecosystem structure and dynamics, and what we're talking about here is ecosystem ecology, which emphasizes the energy flow and chemical cycling into and throughout an ecosystem. So again, just reiterating what an ecosystem consists of. So we're talking again about all of the organisms within a community, as well as the abiotic or non-living parts of that environment. So the organisms interact with one another and also with the non-living part of the environment. So in an ecosystem, we talk about a couple of different types of cycling. There's energy flow, which what that is referring to is the energy that moves into and through an ecosystem, whereas chemical cycling is the cycling of materials within an ecosystem. And I have a good illustration to show you the difference between the two. If my slide will advance. Okay, so here's the difference between the two. So if you look at the left-hand side of this slide here, what we're talking about with energy flow are these kind of indicated by these bright orange, thick orange, wiggly arrows, and then the red arrows on the left. So in this is an example of an ecosystem. So this is a terrarium. It's an enclosed box with some organisms in there, and then we have some non-living materials like the rocks at the bottom and the soils and the rocks that the organisms can interact with. So this is just an example ecosystem. So the energy that enters the terrarium in the form of sunlight is converted into chemical energy by the producer. So in this situation, the producer is the plant, and it's converting the sunlight energy into chemical energy through the process of photosynthesis. And then the animals, like the consumers, like the snails and the worms, take in some of this chemical energy that's store it in organic compounds when they eat the plants. Then there are also organisms living within the soil, like the bacteria, protists, and fungi, which are referred to, remember, as decomposers. They obtain their chemical energy when they decompose the dead remains of the plants and animals. So you see the leaf that's on the ground here, that'll die, and the bacteria and protists will decompose that dead material. So every use of chemical energy by the organisms also involves some form of loss in the form of heat. So that energy is then lost from the ecosystem as a whole. And because so much of the energy that's captured by photosynthesis is lost as heat, the ecosystem would run out of energy if it wasn't powered by a continuous flow of this energy from the sun. So we constantly have an input from the sun, a use of some of that energy by the plants, and then some loss of some of that energy from the system as a whole. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about energy flow. It's this flow, use by the plants, and then the loss of energy as heat. In contrast to energy flow, when we're talking about chemical cycling, we're thinking more about this blue circle with the arrows here. So most ecosystems have a constant input of energy from sunlight, but a limited amount of chemical elements that are used to construct organic molecules. So those chemical elements like carbon and nitrogen are cycled between the living biotic components of an ecosystem and the non-living abiotic components of an ecosystem. So that includes the air, the water, the soil, all of the things that compose that ecosystem. Those chemicals are constantly cycled throughout the system. So the plants are able to acquire a lot of these chemical elements from the inorganic form, so the non-living form of these elements, from the air and the soil, and use them to build organic molecules. So we talked a little bit, you should have gone over some of this in Bio 101, the difference between organic and inorganic molecules. So once the plants are able to use inorganic elements and incorporate them into organic molecules, it's then available. Those are then available to the animals, like the snail, that consume the plant and use those organic molecules. So this is the chemical cycling within an ecosystem. So we talk about, again, going back to this energy budget, because from the last image we saw that there is a limited amount of energy to a system. It depends on how much production occurs within that ecosystem. So this idea of primary production essentially sets the energy budget. So it's kind of like, sort of like a budget that you'd have for your banking. You can only spend as much as the amount that comes in. So this idea of primary production, we've talked about primary producers. So this is the organisms that convert solar energy into chemical energy by photosynthesis. So those primary producers are really the organisms that determine how much energy is available to the ecosystem. So this is why we talk about forestation and deforestation, and why it's extremely important for us to preserve our natural woodlands and things like that. So the total amount of primary production during a given time period is referred to as gross primary production. When those producers use organic material to use, so those all the primary production that occurs, that the plants undergo through photosynthesis, not all of that is then available to the organisms that eat those plants. Those producers actually do their own cellular respiration. So they're doing photosynthesis, but they're also undergoing cellular respiration that uses some of the organic material that they are producing. So once the producers are done with their use, their need of the organic material that they're building, what's left over we refer to as net primary production. So that's the amount of organic material that's added to an ecosystem over time that's available for other organisms to use. Okay, so since different ecosystems vary quite a lot in their primary production and also in their contribution to the total production in the world's biosphere, we can compare the net primary production of different ecosystems. So this image is showing you the net primary production in various ecosystems. And as you can see, there are some, like tropical rainforests, that are some of the largest producers of organic matter on the planet. So you've probably heard in the news that we need to save our rainforests. And it's really true. These are really where we get so much of our energy material for the biotic world. In the aquatic realm, algal beds and coral reefs are kind of the rainforests of the water ecosystem. So it's interesting, the open ocean, has relatively low primary production, and that's because it's so big and so vast and so deep, so much of the ocean is not very productive. So if we take a look at sort of a pyramid or an image of how this production flows from one trophic level to another, we can see that as from primary producers to consumers, only about 10% of the energy stored at each level becomes available to the next level. Sorry again about the slow slides. Okay, so when organic material is transferred from one trophic level to the next, So when one organism consumes another organism, much of that energy is lost. Remember, we saw in the image of the terrarium that a lot of that energy is lost as heat. Some of it's also lost as waste matter. So again, like looking at this caterpillar that's consuming the plant, he might digest and absorb about half the organic matter it eats. Some of it is undigestible and passes through as feces. Of the stuff that it does absorb, it really only uses, it uses about 2/3 of that for fuel just to do its cellular respiration. And only the chemical energy left over after respiration, it can be converted into biomass that makes more caterpillar that can then be passed on to the trophic level. So again, just to the next trophic level to be eaten by something else. So again, about 10% of what the caterpillar is eating becomes more caterpillar that can be passed on to be eaten. The rest is lost as waste material. It goes into just keeping the caterpillar alive. So it's not available for food for the next level. So if we take a look at that caterpillar example and look at it through other, kind of extrapolate that through other ecosystems, we get what we call an energy pyramid. So this kind of illustrates the cumulative loss of energy with each transfer of the food chain. So if we start here with the primary producers at the bottom having about 10,000 kilocalories of biomass available. And each tier of this pyramid shows what is available to the next trophic level of this food chain. And the width of each of these tiers indicates how much of the chemical energy of the tier below is actually new biomass that's available to be eaten by the next trophic level. So if you see here, if you look at these numbers, only about 1% of the energy in the sunlight becomes new biomass, is available as new biomass through primary production. And each trophic level from here on up is roughly 10% of the level before it. So we've talked about herbivores and we've talked about carnivores, things that eat other animals, but we are what we refer to as, most people are omnivores. So people eat both plant material and animal material and meat. So the way we eat determines what kind of consumers we are. So if we're eating plant material like grains and fruit, we're considered primary producers. But as we eat beef and other meat from herbivores, we're secondary consumers. And if we eat animal material of animals like trout and salmon that feed on other animals, we are then tertiary or quaternary consumers, going back to the part one of this lecture. So if we look at how well a field of corn can support human consumption, we'll see that the same field of corn could sustain a whole lot more vegetarians that are eating the corn directly than the meat eaters who are eating cattle that graze off the corn. So because so much of the trophic matter is lost before it becomes available to the next trophic level, we see that the cattle, only 10% of the cattle that are eating the corn is available to meat eaters. So again, a field of corn that can sustain more vegetarians because only 10% of the energy from the cattle is available to the next trophic level. Okay, so moving on to that, we were talked about at the beginning of the lecture about chemicals being cycled between organic matter and non-living stuff. So these ecosystems are continually supplied with an influx of energy from the sun. There's really no, there's some evidence that meteorites there have been sources of chemical elements from meteorites, but it's pretty minimal, and other than that, there are no outside of the Earth influences besides sunlight that provides chemical elements. So we really rely on this recycling of chemicals within ecosystems in order for ecosystems to continue on. So we're going to talk about biogeochemical cycles. So if we break down this word, bio is the living part, geo is the geological aspect of these cycles, and the chemicals that are involved in these cycles. So again, because we have bio, geo, and chemical components to these cycles, we have both living components and non-living components, so abiotic components. So those abiotic components have to come from somewhere. We've talked a little bit about how organic matter is cycled, but we have to be able to get those chemical components from somewhere. So we refer to those as abiotic reservoirs. So it's where those chemicals are kind of stockpiled outside of living organisms, and how those reservoirs are available then to living things. So this is a general model of a biogeochemical cycle, and we're gonna talk about specific biogeochemical cycles that are important to this idea of chemical cycling within ecosystems. But in general terms, we can kind of talk about this in general terms, and then we'll get into the specifics of specific cycles. If we kind of trace this cycle, we can start here where we have the producers that are incorporating chemicals from abiotic reservoirs into organic compounds. And those producers produce organic material, which then can be consumed by consumers. Those consumers incorporate some of those chemicals into their biomass, and both producers and consumers release some of those chemicals back into the environment as waste. So these producers are both putting some of that material back into the ecosystem. And then these decomposers, this step 4 here, they play a central role by breaking down the organic molecules like detritus and plant litter, animal waste, dead organisms, all back into chemical components that go back into the abiotic reservoir to be then available to producers again. Okay, so we're going to walk through these in a little bit more detail based on a couple different chemicals that are crucial to life. So the first being the carbon cycle. The carbon cycle is essentially the component, the base of our respiratory activity. We use carbon-based molecules in order to do all of our metabolic activity. So when we talk about carbon, carbon is the major ingredient of all organic molecules. So this is something that should sound familiar from Bio 101, glucose and sugars and the organic molecules that we talk about. Carbon has an atmospheric reservoir. We all know that there's carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. We all breathe out carbon dioxide. So that's one of those abiotic reservoirs that we have. Where carbon is available to living things. Carbon, because it's in the atmosphere, it has a global cycle, but it also resides in plant and animal biomass. So not all carbon is inorganic. A lot of carbon is stored in animal biomass. It's also stored in fossil fuels, soils, so a lot of abiotic sources as well. Sedimentary rocks are very carbon laden, and we have dissolved carbon in aquatic environments as well. So how is carbon cycled? Again, it really is dependent upon photosynthesis and cellular respiration. And this is the kind of the basics of the carbon cycle. So starting here with this number one, photosynthesis removes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and incorporates it into, so we have CO2 from the atmosphere being incorporated through photosynthesis into organic molecules. So it's being incorporated into molecules that make up this tree. And then those organic molecules are passed along the food chain by consumers. So we have these primary consumers that are feeding on vegetation. And then that cellular respiration by producers and consumers returns, we all breathe out carbon dioxide. One of the waste products of cellular respiration is CO2. So some of that carbon makes it back into the atmosphere as CO2, which then again can re-enter the cycle. The organic material that is not released as CO2 makes it into organic molecules, which eventually will, those organic molecules, those organisms, will eventually die. And decomposers will break down those carbon compounds that is in detritus, and plant litter, things like that. And eventually that will also be released as carbon dioxide as those decomposers break those molecules down. So one other area where, if we kind of take number 5 out of this equation, this would be a really efficient way to cycle carbon dioxide in the environment. But one thing that's happened is that as we have increased the use of fossil fuels and burning of carbon-based materials, it's raising the level of CO2 in the atmosphere, because as these things are burned, a whole lot of carbon dioxide is released into the atmosphere. And what we're finding is that this significant increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is leading to that global climate change we're so concerned about becoming not becoming a real issue, but that is a real issue that we're facing today. Okay, so another chemical cycle that is important to understand, because it's a chemical that's necessary for living organisms, is the phosphorus cycle. So the phosphorus cycle, organisms require phosphorus. If you remember when we studied cell biology, the phospholipid bilayer that makes up cell membranes. So phospholipids make up all of our cells. It's also a main component of our genetic material, of our nucleic acids, DNA and RNA. And that molecule that is sort of the currency of doing work in our cells, ATP, has a phosphorus component as well. So the phosphorus is really important. It also makes up some of our bones and teeth. It's a mineral that we actually use for structural components as well. But it does not have an atmospheric component. Plants can't just pull it out of the atmosphere like we can with carbon. Most of the phosphorus comes from the soils, and in particular it's stored in rocks. So as rocks are weathered and become soils, it becomes more available to living things. So in terrestrial ecosystems, this doesn't happen very quickly. It's not, because rocks not dissolve very quickly. So phosphorus can become a real limiting factor. It can become something that's kind of diminished over time and limits what kind of growth can occur in an ecosystem. Okay, so here's a general model of the phosphorus cycle. Again, This is stored in rocks. This is the abiotic reservoir, is rocks and soils. So the weathering or breaking down of that rock gradually over time adds inorganic phosphate into the soil. And plants can assimilate. Here we have the plant here in number 2. Its phosphates are in the soil in an inorganic form. Plants can assimilate that phosphorus, those phosphate ions, into organic compounds. And again, I mentioned a mutualistic relationship between plants and the fungi mycorrhizae. This is where those mycorrhizae come into play. They're very efficient at helping the plant to incorporate this inorganic phosphate into organic compounds. So the consumers then, the primary consumers, obtain phosphorus in an organic form by eating the plants. The phosphates are returned to the soil in the same way as carbon, in the form of decomposers that are decomposing any plant and any dead plant and animal material. So decomposers deposit phosphates back into the soil. Some of that phosphate, so it becomes available in the soil here. Some of the phosphate will drain, it can be washed out of soils into the neighboring aquatic environments. And it may settle down and may become new rocks, they kind of settle into new rocks over time. And that is no longer, that settled out phosphate is no longer available to living organisms. So the phosphates in the water could be available to primary producers in the water column, but what settles out is no longer available to the cycle. There are some geologic processes that will uplift those rocks, things like tectonic shift, volcanic activity, things like that could uplift that rock and re-expose it to a weathering process. But this process here of phosphates becoming re-available from settled rock is a process that happens over millions of years. Okay, so another major nutrient that is necessary for all living things is nitrogen. And the nitrogen cycle is very dependent on bacteria. So all of these processes depend on decomposers, which include bacteria, but bacteria is a major influence in the cycling of nitrogen. So we've talked about, again, in cell biology, you talked about how nitrogen is a major ingredient of the proteins that make up all of our structural materials. It's also a major component of our genetic material, and it's essential to the structure and functioning of all organisms. It's often what we call, again, a limiting factor in plant nutrients. So that's why farmers and gardeners will add nitrogen to the soil, because it's often not as abundantly available as the plants would need. And the reason there's not a lot of nitrogen in soils is because it is really happy living in the atmosphere. So nitrogen has 2 of these abiotic reservoirs. I mentioned the soil, but it's extremely happy in the atmosphere, because if you go back to the biochemistry part of Bio 101 and how atoms interact with one another based on their valence shells, nitrogen is really happy being N2. So it will bond with another nitrogen atom and be N2 gas, and makes up about 80% of our atmosphere. So this term nitrogen fixation, as I mentioned, that N2 gas that's really, really happy in the atmosphere, because it's such a stable molecule, it's not very available to plants and organisms. So this idea of nitrogen fixation, what that is, it's the process of bacteria that can actually take that nitrogen, that really stable molecule, and convert it into organic compounds that can then be used by plants. These bacteria are really abundant in the soil. They sometimes live in the roots of some plants. And again, they can convert that nitrogen gas that's super abundant in the atmosphere into into things like ammonium and nitrate, which are key components of organic organisms. Okay, so here's the general nitrogen cycle, pretty simplified, but this is going to show you the different roles that bacteria play in the nitrogen cycle. So, as I mentioned, some bacteria will live in a symbiotic, remember we talked about symbiotic interactions. They'll have a symbiotic relationship in the roots of certain species of plants, and those, we call them nitrogen fixing bacteria. So because they do that nitrogen fixation, they take N2 gas and they make it into molecules that the plant can use. A group of plants that's really has a very well incorporated mutualistic relationship with these bacteria are legumes, things like beans, which is why you'll often see farms where crop rotation occurs, and that the reason being partially is that plants like corn they're not very good at having this mutualistic relationship with these bacteria. So the farmers will plant beans one year, which will help the soils to become rich in nitrogen, and then the next year plant corn, and that nitrogen will be available to the corn. So again, this first bacterial interaction being the bacteria that can fix nitrogen gas. There are also some bacteria that are just living in the soil on their own that can do nitrogen fixation as well. That nitrogen then is available in the soil as ammonium, which is a molecule that is necessary for many functions in living organisms. And then again, I'm not going to expect you to be extremely familiar with the different cycling of the different molecules and how that all works, but just kind of note that there are these different types of nitrogen molecules becoming available through different types of bacterial interactions. So after the nitrogen's fixed, some of this ammonium in the soil is taken up and used by plants, and some of it goes into this next step, another bacterial interaction in which the resulting molecule is what we call nitrate, which is NO3. So just to kind of the first step here, these bacteria that can take N2 gas and make it into ammonium, those are nitrogen fixers, nitrogen fixing bacteria. The ones that can convert ammonium into nitrates, we refer to those as nitrifying bacteria. And again, this is something that if you go into more advanced biology courses, you'll get really familiar with this nitrogen cycle. So that the reason this step is important is that those nitrates are much more easily assimilated by plants, which need these molecules to build things like amino acids and proteins. So again, these nitrates can be assimilated into plants. So some of the ammonium is assimilated into plants. Some of that ammonium is converted to nitrates, which also can be assimilated into organic materials. Some of those nitrates, though, sorry about the weird flow, guys. The phone started to ring. So again, so these nitrates, some can be assimilated by plants. And then I think I jumped ahead a step here just to mention that when an herbivore, like this rabbit, eats a plant, it will digest those proteins into organic compounds like amino acids and proteins. Again, we know that some of this will then, those organisms at some point will die and become detritus, which will then be decomposed by decomposers, which will, the resulting molecule being ammonium back into the soil. So we have one process here where nitrogen fixation occurs from the atmosphere. It's assimilated into plants and organic molecules, dies, and becomes ammonium back into the soil. Some of the nitrates, though, are not assimilated into organic compounds. There are these really essential bacteria called denitrifiers, and what they do is they are able to take this nitrate and rebind it into that N2 gas and release it back into the atmosphere. So in aquatic environments, primary production is naturally limited by low levels of phosphorus and nitrogen. However, there's this process called eutrophication here. I'm sorry about, I can't write a straight line with this pen. But eutrophication, what that refers to is a rapid input of nutrients, phosphorus and nitrogen, into an aquatic environment from things like runoff from agricultural fertilizers or other industries that have these waste products. And what happens is that this rapid increase in nutrients makes the organisms that are being limited by a lack of those nutrients, makes them explode. So this is where we have things like algal blooms. And what happens is that those algal blooms will kind of block out the sunlight from penetrating the waters and cause decreased species diversity due to lack of nutrients available to the lower down in the water column. So this eutrophication, even though nutrients sounds like a really good word, too many nutrients can be a really bad thing, particularly in aquatic environments. And why does that matter to us? We kind of rely on water for most things. We need a fresh water supply. Some of our foods come from aquatic environments. It's a very important ecosystem for recycling of nutrients and decomposing waste. And we talked about in our first lecture of the semester about how ocean currents and water temperatures drive the climate and even air quality of the planet. So there are a couple other ecosystems that are essential to our well-being. Wetlands, you may have heard about wetlands. So this is kind of in between an open water ecosystem and a terrestrial ecosystem. These are areas that are very diverse in their species, so high species diversity. They're very important in buffering against tidal waves and hurricane storm surges, and they're really efficient because they can absorb so much water. They're very important in reducing the impact of flooding in coastal areas. And they're also, because the water, because they kind of allow the water to slow down and penetrate the soils for such a long time, they're really, really efficient at filtering pollution out of water. And they have natural vegetation that keeps the soils really fertile, and the vegetation is deep rooted and can help prevent landslides and mudslides in coastal regions as well. So finally, just to wrap up this, not to feel like I'm lecturing you too much on sustainability. If you know anything about my background, my background is in ecology, so this idea of sustainability is deep in my heart. We also, we have these ecosystems that we create. They're essential to our well-being. Agriculture is extremely important as well, but there's a careful balance between sustaining ourselves through agricultural and advanced manipulation of our environment, and and using practices that are sustainable in conserving our natural resources. So we'll probably throughout the semester going to come back to this idea of sustainability, managing our resources in a way that we can proliferate and be the successful species that we have been, but in a way that we also leave the resources behind that other species and future generations are going to be able to meet their needs as well. So that is all I have for you for this talk today for chapter 37. I hope you guys are all doing well, and please, as always, reach out with any questions that you have.